My kids were ashamed of me because I have Down syndrome. Can you imagine hearing your own children whisper to their friends that they wish they had a normal father? The pain of those words cut deeper than any knife could. I gave them everything I had, my time, my strength, my love. Yet in their eyes, I was nothing more than a shadow, something to be hidden away. Before I tell you my story, I want to ask you something. Would you forgive children who treated you like that? Or would you let them taste the bitterness of regret? And while you think about that, don't forget to subscribe to this channel if you believe in justice and lessons from life. Also, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far my voice travels tonight. I was not born with many gifts. People looked at me and saw weakness. Some even laughed at the way I spoke, the way I walked, the way I struggled to learn things that others found simple. But what they didn't see was the fire inside me, the fire that came from wanting to live with dignity, to prove that love and determination could outshine any limitation. As a child, I was mocked, pushed aside, and told I would never amount to anything. But deep inside, I made a silent promise to myself. I would build a life worth living. I would show the world that even a man like me could stand tall. When I became a father, I thought all my suffering had a purpose. I thought my children would see me for the man I was, not just for the syndrome I carried. I imagined them holding my hand proudly, introducing me as their father, smiling when they looked into my eyes. But dreams and reality don't always match. I will never forget the first time I overheard my son tell someone, "Don't come to my house. My dad is different." He didn't say it with pride. He said it with shame. And that shame wasn't mine. It was his. But at that moment, my heart broke in silence. Little did they know, the father they rejected was quietly preparing a lesson that would stay with them forever. When I look back at my childhood, it feels like opening a book filled with pages torn and stained with tears. I was born different, and people noticed it from the very beginning. Some whispered, some laughed, and some simply shook their heads, as if my life was already written in failure before I even had a chance to live it. I didn't always understand their words, but I understood their looks, the stares that told me I didn't belong. School was the hardest place for me. I wanted friends. I wanted to laugh and play like the other kids, but instead, I was often the joke. Children can be cruel without even knowing it. They imitated my speech, mocked my slower steps, and sometimes even ran away from me, as if I was carrying some kind of disease. I remember sitting alone at recess, holding back tears, wishing I could be anyone but me. But at home, I had angels, my parents. They never saw me as a mistake. My mother would hold my face in her hands and say, "You are special, not because of what people think you can't do, but because of the love you carry inside." My father would work long hours, then sit with me at night, helping me with the simplest tasks, never losing patience. Where the world saw weakness, they saw possibility. Their love became my shield. Every cruel word I heard at school, every laugh that pierced my heart, I carried home and laid it down in front of my parents, and they gave me strength to pick myself up again. They made me believe that even if the whole world turned away, I still had worth. I grew up knowing that life would never be easy for me, but I also grew up with a fire lit inside. I didn't want to prove people wrong just for myself. I wanted to prove them wrong for my parents. They sacrificed everything to protect me, and I swore I would someday give them a reason to be proud. That promise carried me into adulthood. Even though the world tried to push me down, I pushed back, and when I finally found work, I thought it was the beginning of a life where I could stand tall. I didn't know then that my biggest battles weren't with strangers or bullies. They would be with the very children I once cradled in my arms. When I was old enough to work, many people doubted I could even hold a job. They looked at me and saw limits, not possibilities. I still remember the first time I walked into a shop and asked for work. The manager didn't even look me in the eye. He just shook his head and said, "We don't need someone like you here." Those words stung, but I didn't give up. I couldn't. I had promised myself I would build a life worth living, no matter how many doors slammed in my face. Eventually, I found a small job at a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, sweeping floors, carrying boxes, organizing shelves, but it was honest work. And for me, it was proof that I was capable. Every day I arrived early, stayed late, and worked harder than anyone else. My body ached, my hands blistered, but my heart was proud. People often underestimated me, but that became my secret advantage. They never saw me coming, never realized how determined I was. I learned to save money, even if it was just a few coins at the end of the week. I learned discipline, showing up no matter how tired I felt. And slowly, something inside me began to change. I stopped looking at myself through the eyes of those who doubted me and started seeing myself through the love my parents had given me. But the world never stopped testing me. Some coworkers whispered behind my back, mocking my speech or laughing when I made mistakes. At first, those laughs burned my spirit, but over time, I grew stronger. Instead of fighting their cruelty with anger, I fought it with persistence. Every insult became fuel. Every doubt became a challenge. And then, something remarkable happened. One of the supervisors noticed my dedication. While others slacked off, I kept working. While others complained, I stayed silent and steady. He pulled me aside one day and said, "You might not be like everyone else, but you've got more heart than most of them." For the first time, someone outside my family saw my worth. That moment lit a spark in me that never died. Little by little, I began to build not just a life, but a purpose. I didn't know yet that love would come into my life, or that I would one day be called Dad. All I knew then was that no matter what the world thought of me, I was going to stand tall. I never believed love was meant for someone like me. I thought people would always look at my face, hear my voice, and walk away before they ever saw my heart. But then she came into my life, the woman who would one day become my wife. I met her at the grocery store where I sometimes helped stack shelves. She worked at the bakery next door, and every evening when I left, I would see her arranging bread and cakes in the window. I used to stop and watch, not because of the bread, but because of her smile. It was the kind of smile that could melt even the coldest day. One evening, she caught me looking. I froze, my heart racing, expecting her to laugh at me the way others did, but instead, she smiled wider and waved. The next day, she came over with a small paper bag. Inside was a warm loaf of bread. She said, "I see how hard you work. You deserve this." I didn't know what to say. No one outside my parents had ever shown me kindness without pity. From that moment, I knew she was different. We started talking. At first, I was nervous, afraid she would eventually change her mind once she noticed all the things about me that others mocked. But she never flinched. She listened patiently. She laughed at my jokes. She asked me questions like I mattered. For the first time, I felt like a man, not someone defined by a syndrome, but someone worthy of love. Months passed, and our bond grew stronger. She told me she admired my strength, that she respected the way I kept going, despite life's obstacles. I couldn't believe it. No one had ever spoken to me that way before. When I told her about my fears of being a husband, of maybe never being good enough, she took my hands and said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to love with your whole heart. That's more than enough." So, with trembling hands and a racing heart, I asked her to marry me. And to my amazement, she said yes, without hesitation. That moment changed everything. For the first time, I wasn't just fighting to prove myself to the world, I was fighting for us. I was fighting to give her the life she deserved. I didn't know then that our love would also bring me the greatest joy and the deepest sorrow. The day I first held my child in my arms, I felt like the whole world had shifted. Nothing else mattered, not the people who doubted me, not the stares, not the laughter I had endured all my life. In that tiny bundle of life, I saw my entire purpose. I remember looking down at my baby's face, so small and pure, and whispering, "I will love you more than anyone ever loved me. I will protect you, no matter what." Becoming a father was the greatest honor of my life. Every cry in the night, every diaper to change, every small giggle, it was a blessing to me. I didn't see those moments as work. I saw them as proof that I was needed. For the first time, someone relied on me completely, and I embraced it with all my heart. When my second child was born, my joy doubled. I thought to myself, now my family is whole. I would sit on the floor, both children in my lap, their tiny hands tugging at my shirt, and I felt like the richest man alive. I didn't have much money, but I had love, and in those days I believed love would always be enough. I dreamed of raising them to be proud of who they were and where they came from. I wanted them to see that even though their father was born different, he fought every day to give them a better life. I wanted them to carry my story like a badge of honor, to say, "My dad may not be like yours, but he's the strongest man I know." I worked hard, sometimes too hard, but I never let my exhaustion show when I came home. My children didn't need to see my tiredness. They needed to see my smile. And oh, how I smiled when they ran to me, shouting, "Daddy," with arms wide open. Those little voices were my music, my strength, my everything. But life has a way of testing promises. As the children grew older, I started to notice small changes. They no longer ran to me as quickly. Their laughter was different, sometimes nervous when I was around. I ignored it at first, convincing myself it was just part of them growing up. Yet deep down, a fear began to take root, a fear that my love might not be enough to shield them from the cruel whispers of the world, a fear that one day they would look at me not with pride, but with shame. The first time I felt it, it was like a crack forming in the center of my heart. My children were no longer little. They had started school, and suddenly the world outside our home began to shape the way they saw me. At home, I was still daddy, the one who tucked them in at night, the one who made silly faces to make them laugh. But outside, I became something else, something they didn't want their friends to see. It started small. At a school play, I went to cheer for my son, clapping louder than anyone else, my heart bursting with pride. When it was over, I rushed forward to hug him, but he pulled back quickly and whispered through clenched teeth, "Don't embarrass me." Those words hit me like a stone. Embarrass him? I thought my presence was love. To him, in that moment, it was shame. Another time, at a birthday party, I heard the cruel laughter of other children. They were mocking the way I spoke, imitating me like I was some kind of clown. My daughter stood there, her face red, but she didn't defend me. She looked away, pretending she didn't even know me. I smiled through it, trying to act strong, but inside I was breaking. And then came the night that shattered me. I was walking past their room, and I heard my son talking to a friend on the phone. He said, "Don't come over. My dad is different. You wouldn't understand. It's embarrassing." I froze in the hallway, my hand against the wall to keep myself from falling. My own child thought I was an embarrassment. My love, my sacrifices, my devotion, all reduced to something he wanted to hide. I went to bed that night with tears soaking my pillow. My wife held me, whispering that children sometimes say things they don't mean, that they were just young and trying to fit in. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that my children would grow out of it, that one day they would see me not as something to hide, but as the father who gave them everything. But the truth was already unfolding before my eyes. The more they grew, the more distance they put between us. And I began to wonder if the greatest pain of my life wouldn't come from strangers mocking me, but from my own children turning their backs on me. As my children grew into their teenage years, the small cracks in our bond widened into deep, painful gaps. I could feel them pulling away from me, step by step, as if they were ashamed to be seen walking beside me. When they were little, they used to cling to my hand. Now, they yanked their hands free the moment we stepped outside. In the beginning, I told myself it was just part of growing up, but the truth was harder. It wasn't independence they wanted, it was distance. I remember one afternoon I went to pick my daughter up from school. I stood by the gate, waiting with a smile, just like the other parents. When she came out and saw me, her face dropped. She glanced around at her friends and then walked past me as if I was invisible. My heart sank. I called her name, but she just said, "Not here, Dad," in a low, hurried voice. That night, she barely spoke to me at all. My son wasn't any better. Whenever his friends came over, he would ask me to stay in the other room. He said it was because the house was small and he wanted privacy, but I knew the truth. He didn't want them to see me. Once, when I walked into the living room to offer snacks, I caught one of his friends laughing under his breath at me. My son didn't stop him. He just looked down, ashamed, not ashamed of his friend's cruelty, ashamed of me. I tried to brush it off. I tried to tell myself that teenagers can be cruel without meaning it, that they were only trying to fit in. But late at night, when the house was quiet, I would sit alone and wonder, had all my love, all my sacrifices, meant nothing? How could the children I raised with so much tenderness look at me like I was a burden? The distance grew with every year. They stopped sharing their thoughts with me, stopped laughing with me, stopped sitting by my side. The house that once rang with their voices now felt like a place where I was tolerated, not loved. And still, I said nothing. I swallowed the pain, telling myself that maybe one day they would realize. But deep inside, I felt the storm building. I knew the day would come when silence would no longer be enough. The day my wife died, a part of me died with her. She had been my anchor, my shield, the one person who always reminded me that I was enough. When the world laughed at me, she was the one who held my hand and whispered, "Don't listen to them. You're stronger than they'll ever be." Without her, I felt like a tree ripped from its roots, left to sway alone in the storm. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her frail hand. Her eyes were tired, but still full of love. She looked at me and whispered, "Take care of them. Don't let them forget who you are." I nodded through my tears, promising her that I would hold the family together, no matter how broken I felt inside. And then she was gone, just like that. The room grew silent, and so did my heart. I thought my children and I would cling to each other after losing her. I thought grief would draw us closer, that they would finally see how much I needed them and how much they needed me. But instead, it pushed us further apart. They didn't look at me for comfort. They looked at me like I was just another burden to carry. At the funeral, I stood at the front, my hands trembling, trying to honor the woman who had been my everything. My children stood beside me, their faces cold, their eyes avoiding mine. They cried, yes, but not with me. They didn't reach for me, didn't lean on me. I was invisible, even in my own grief. In the weeks that followed, the house became colder than ever. My wife's laughter was gone, and so was the warmth she always spread between us. I tried to cook meals, tried to keep the house clean, tried to fill the empty space she left behind, but my children didn't notice. They spent more time outside, away from me, and when they were home, the silence between us was unbearable. Sometimes I would sit in the living room at night, staring at her empty chair, and wonder how I was supposed to do this alone. I had promised her I would take care of them, but how could I, when they wanted nothing to do with me? Instead of becoming a family bound by loss, we became strangers living under the same roof. And as much as it broke me, I began to realize the truth. Without her, I was no longer their father in their eyes. I was just the man they wished they didn't have. The silence in our home eventually turned into something much worse. It became open humiliation. My children no longer hid their shame in whispers or sideways glances. They began to speak it out loud, as if cutting me with their words gave them power. One evening, I walked into the kitchen while my son and daughter were talking. They didn't notice me at first. I heard my son laugh and say, "I can't believe I'm stuck with him as my dad. Everyone else has fathers they can look up to. Mine can't even talk right." My daughter giggled, adding, "No wonder nobody wants to come over. He's so embarrassing." I froze, standing in the doorway, my hands trembling. When they finally saw me, their laughter stopped, but they didn't apologize. My son just rolled his eyes and muttered, "See, this is what I mean." I wanted to scream, to tell them how much those words hurt, but all that came out was silence. I turned away, hiding the tears burning my eyes. Another time, at the grocery store, I ran into one of their friends. I greeted him warmly, proud to be seen as their father, but my daughter quickly cut me off, saying, "Come on, Dad, don't start. Let's go." The way she said Dad wasn't affectionate. It was sharp, like an insult. Her friend laughed and she walked faster, leaving me trailing behind like an unwanted shadow. The worst moment came on a rainy night. We had an argument after dinner. Nothing serious, just me asking about their schoolwork. My son suddenly snapped and shouted, "You're not even a real father. You're just a burden." His words rang in my ears like thunder. A burden. That was what I had become in the eyes of the very children I raised with all the love I had. I went to my room that night, sat on the edge of my bed, and cried harder than I had since I was a child. But in those tears, something changed. For the first time, my grief turned into something else. I realized I couldn't keep begging for their love or waiting for their respect. If they saw me as nothing, then I would show them just how wrong they were. That night, I made a decision that would turn all my silent suffering into a lesson they would never forget. That night, after my son called me a burden, I sat in the darkness of my room, staring at my hands. These hands had carried boxes in warehouses, scrubbed floors, lifted groceries, and held my children when they were small. These were not the hands of a burden. These were the hands of a man who had fought for every inch of dignity he had. Yet to my children, they were invisible. I realized then that love alone was not enough. I had spent my whole life giving them everything, my time, my energy, my devotion, but I had given it without asking for respect. I thought respect would come naturally, but I was wrong. And so, I made a vow to myself. If they could not see my worth as a father, then I would make them see my worth as a man. From that night on, I stopped waiting for their approval. I stopped trying to prove myself with hugs and soft words that they only threw back in my face. Instead, I turned all my energy into something else, building a life they could no longer deny. I decided I would rise in silence, and when the time was right, I would show them who I truly was. I began working extra hours, taking jobs no one else wanted. I saved every coin I could, no matter how small. I started learning about things people thought I would never understand: money, investments, property. People underestimated me, and that was my greatest weapon. While the world looked past me, I was planning. While my children dismissed me, I was preparing. There were nights when my body ached and I wanted to give up. But then I would hear my son's voice in my head: "You're just a burden." And that pain became fuel. Every insult, every laugh, every cold glance, they became the fire that pushed me forward. I didn't tell my children what I was doing. I didn't ask for their help or their support. I let them keep their distance. Let them believe I was still the same man they could dismiss. Because one day, when the moment was right, I would show them everything I had built behind their backs. And when that day came, they would finally understand what it meant to be ashamed of themselves. The years that followed were some of the hardest of my life, but also the most important. I lived two lives, one my children could see, and one they could not. To them, I was still the father they brushed aside, the man they avoided introducing to their friends. But behind closed doors, when they weren't looking, I was fighting battles they could never imagine. I took every job I could find. During the day, I worked at the warehouse, lifting heavy boxes until my muscles screamed. In the evenings, I cleaned offices, pushing brooms through empty hallways while others slept. On weekends, I helped at the local market, carrying crates, stacking goods, doing whatever work people thought I was only half capable of. I didn't complain. Every drop of sweat was a step closer to my goal. I lived simply. While others spent their wages on luxuries, I saved mine. I patched up old shoes instead of buying new ones. I ate plain meals, never wasting a coin. And when I had enough saved, I started to learn how money could grow. People assumed I couldn't understand those things, but I read, I asked questions, I listened carefully. It took time, but I began to understand investments, savings accounts, and even property deals. Slowly, quietly, my efforts started to bear fruit. There were nights when my body could barely move. My back ached, my hands were raw, my feet blistered. I would collapse into bed long after midnight, only to rise again before dawn. And still, I never let my children see my struggle. Why? Because I knew they wouldn't care. They would dismiss it, maybe even mock it. So I kept it hidden, like a seed growing underground, waiting for the day it would burst through the soil. At times, loneliness crept into my heart. My wife's absence still haunted me. I often wished she could see me, see how hard I was trying, not just for survival, but for dignity. I imagined her smile, her voice telling me she was proud. That thought alone kept me alive during the darkest nights. My children thought they were distancing themselves from a weak man, a father they could be ashamed of. They didn't know that while they ignored me, I was building something far stronger than their judgment. I was building proof that I was not a burden, but a man capable of far more than they ever gave me credit for. After years of silent struggle, the fruits of my labor finally began to appear. At first it was small victories, being able to buy a second-hand car without borrowing a coin, paying off debts that had once weighed on me like chains, and slowly watching my savings grow beyond what I ever thought possible. For a man everyone dismissed, those little victories felt like mountains conquered. Then came the bigger steps. With the help of a kind neighbor who trusted me, I bought a small piece of land. Everyone thought it was useless, just an empty lot with weeds, but I held on to it. Years later, when developers came looking, that forgotten piece of land turned into gold. What I earned from that single deal was more than I had made in years of backbreaking labor. I reinvested it wisely, and little by little, I built something real, something solid. The people in my community started to notice. The same ones who once looked at me with pity now greeted me with respect. They saw my discipline, my perseverance, and they began to admire it. Some even came to me for advice on saving and investing. Imagine that. The boy everyone mocked in school, the man they laughed at in the warehouse, now giving guidance to others. It was a victory sweeter than words could describe. But at home, nothing changed. My children remained blind to all of it. To them, I was still the father they couldn't proudly introduce to anyone. They never asked how I managed, never noticed the way I was quietly building security beneath their feet. They were too busy trying to escape me, pretending I didn't exist, and I let them, because I knew the time would come when all my secrets would rise to the surface, and they would be forced to see me for who I truly was. In the meantime, I found joy in helping others. I donated quietly to charities that supported children with Down syndrome, children who were told they couldn't dream, I wanted them to know that they could, that even someone like me, someone the world underestimated, could carve out a place of pride. While my children hid me from their friends, the world outside began to respect me. The irony was bitter, but I didn't let it break me. Instead, I let it grow inside me, feeding the storm I was preparing, because I knew, sooner or later, the day of reckoning would come. The moment that cut the deepest came years later, when my children were grown. By then, I had built more than they could ever imagine, but they still didn't see me. Or maybe they chose not to. The shame they carried toward me never faded. It only grew sharper with time. And then one day, it pierced me straight through the heart. My daughter was getting married. For a father, that should have been the proudest moment of my life. I had dreamed of walking her down the aisle, of holding her hand and whispering that she would always be my little girl, even as she started a new life. But instead, she came to me with cold eyes and words I will never forget. "Dad, it's better if you don't come. People might not understand. I don't want you to embarrass me on my big day." Embarrass her. That was what she thought of me. Not as her father who raised her, not as the man who worked himself to the bone to give her a better life, but as an embarrassment. My heart shattered, but I said nothing. I simply nodded, walked away, and let my tears fall where she couldn't see them. It didn't stop there. My son had his own milestone, a graduation ceremony. I was so excited, imagining myself sitting in the audience, clapping until my hands went numb as he received his diploma. But when I told him I wanted to come, he sighed and said, "Dad, maybe you should just stay home. I don't want people asking questions." 2 children, 2 betrayals, both choosing their pride over their father. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photos on the wall, pictures of me holding them as babies, of us smiling together when they were small, of moments I thought would last forever. But the smiles in those frames were lies now. To them, those memories meant nothing. And yet, as painful as it was, I didn't beg to be included. I didn't argue or plead. I realized then that they would only learn the truth through pain, the same pain they had poured into me. If they wanted to see me as invisible, then I would make them see just how powerful my invisibility had become. They thought they were cutting me out to protect their pride. What they didn't know was that they were cutting themselves off from the very man who held their future in his hands. After being shut out of their most important moments, I told myself there was still one last thing I could do. I could try again. I could remind them of the man I was, not the man they imagined me to be. So I sat down one night, alone at the kitchen table, and began to write. I wrote to my daughter first. The words poured from my heart. I told her how proud I was of her, how beautiful she looked when she was a little girl twirling in her mother's dresses, how I had dreamed of walking her down the aisle. I admitted my pain at being left behind, but I forgave her because my love was greater than my hurt. I ended the letter with a simple wish that one day she would remember me not as an embarrassment, but as her father who loved her more than life itself. Then I wrote to my son. I reminded him of the nights I stayed awake with him when he was sick, holding him close while he cried. I told him how proud I was of his graduation, even if I wasn't there to see it. I begged him, not as a man with Down syndrome, but as a father, to see me with different eyes. I told him respect was all I ever wanted, not riches, not recognition, just respect. I sealed those letters with trembling hands and gave them quietly, hoping, praying, that maybe my words would break through the walls they had built. Days passed, weeks, and then I found my daughter's letter crumpled in the trash. My son never even mentioned his. When I asked if they had read them, my daughter sighed and said, "Dad, you don't need to keep doing this. Just stop. It's embarrassing." Embarrassing. Again that word. That night, I sat in the quiet house, holding the empty space where my wife used to sit, and I felt something inside me harden. I had tried every way I knew to love them. I had forgiven, I had endured, I had begged, and I had poured my heart into words they threw away like garbage, so I decided no more. If they could not value my love, maybe they would learn to value what I controlled. If they could not respect my heart, then they would be forced to respect my strength. The time for tears had ended. The time for lessons had begun. After that night, something inside me shifted. For too long, I had let their rejection weaken me, but now it became my fuel. I looked in the mirror and no longer saw a broken man longing for scraps of love. I saw a father who had survived storms most people couldn't imagine. I decided if my children would not give me respect, then I would carve it out of life itself. I started with my body. Years of hard labor had worn me down, but I refused to let myself fade. I began to walk every morning, no matter the weather. At first, my legs trembled, and I could barely breathe after a mile, but day by day, I grew stronger. I learned to eat better, to rest properly, and to take care of the body that had carried me this far. Soon, neighbors began to notice the difference. "You look healthier," they said. "You've got more energy than men half your age." Their words fed me in ways my children's silence never could. Then I worked on my mind. I kept reading, kept learning. Money, investments, even public speaking. I practiced talking to myself in the mirror, slowly, carefully, until my words flowed with more confidence. I wanted to prove to myself that my voice mattered, that it wasn't something to mock, but something to hear. And as the months passed, people in the community began to invite me to speak at small gatherings. Me, the man who had once been laughed at, now standing in front of crowds, sharing lessons about perseverance and dignity. My children knew none of this. To them, I was still invisible, still the father they brushed aside. And I let them believe it, because I wasn't ready to reveal what I was building. Not yet. They were too blind to see my worth. But blindness has a way of being shattered by truth. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. Not because of my children, but in spite of them. I realized I didn't need their approval to stand tall. I had already become a man my wife would have been proud of, a man my parents would have smiled upon. Still, I knew the day would come when my children would face me not as the father they ignored, but as the man they never expected me to be. And when that day arrived, I would be ready. It happened slowly at first, like cracks spreading across a wall. My children, who once looked down on me, started to face problems of their own. I could see it in the way they avoided my eyes, the way their voices tightened when money came up. Bills were piling up, jobs weren't as secure as they thought, and their perfect lives weren't so perfect anymore. One evening my son came by, his face pale and restless. He sat at the table, drumming his fingers, not even looking at me. Finally he said, "Dad, I need some help. Just a loan for a few months. I'll pay you back." A loan. He spoke to me like I was a bank, not his father. I didn't say yes, and I didn't say no. I just listened, nodding quietly, my heart both aching and hardening at the same time. Days later, my daughter showed up. She was dressed nicely, as always, but her eyes betrayed her. She tried to act casual, smiling in a way that felt forced. "Dad, things are a little tight right now. Could you help me out? Just until we get back on our feet." There it was again, the expectation. The same children who once shut me out of their proudest moments were now turning to me, expecting me to carry them through their weakest. They didn't see me as a father before, but now, when they needed something, suddenly I was useful. Inside, I felt a storm. A part of me wanted to say yes immediately. That's what fathers do, right? They protect their children, even when those children have turned their backs. But another part of me remembered the pain. The times they called me an embarrassment, the nights I cried alone, the letters they tossed in the trash. I remembered all of it, so I stayed quiet. I didn't reveal what I had, didn't let them see the years of sacrifice and discipline that had built my security. I only told them, "We'll see, I'll think about it." They didn't like that answer. My son frowned, my daughter sighed, but they left without pressing me further. What they didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The cracks in their lives were widening, and soon they would come running back, desperate for the very man they once rejected. And when that day came, I would not meet them as the father they mocked. I would meet them as the man who held their future in his hands. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I thought. My children came to me again, this time not with small requests, but with desperation in their voices. Their debts had grown larger, their lives heavier. They sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I had once written them letters of love they never read. Now their eyes were filled with expectation, not affection. "Dad," my son said firmly, "we need you. You have to help us. We can't do this without you." My daughter added quickly, "You must have something saved up. Don't keep it from us. We're your children. You're supposed to help us." I looked at them in silence for a long moment. The children who once couldn't bear to be seen with me were now demanding my support. It was almost laughable, if it weren't so heartbreaking. I took a deep breath and decided it was time. No more hiding, no more silence. They wanted to know what I had. Then they would know. I stood up and walked to the cabinet where I kept my papers. For years, those files had sat there untouched by anyone but me, proof of my sacrifices, proof of my rise. I laid them out on the table, one by one: property deeds, bank statements, investment portfolios, documents that showed I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. Their eyes widened. My son grabbed one of the papers, flipping through it as if it were in a foreign language. My daughter stared at the deeds, her mouth open, speechless. You own all this?" my son finally stammered. I nodded. "Yes. While you were ashamed of me, while you were hiding me from the world, I was building a life you never even imagined. I worked while you laughed. I saved while you wasted. I invested while you ignored me. Everything you see here is mine, earned with these hands you called useless." The room fell silent. I could see the shame settling on their faces, the regret beginning to surface. For years, they had treated me like a burden, and now they were confronted with the truth. The father they rejected was stronger, wiser, and wealthier than they had ever known. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "You wanted me invisible, but now you will never be able to look away again." For a long time, they just sat there, staring at the papers on the table, their faces pale and their hands trembling. My son finally spoke, his voice low, almost pleading. "Dad, we didn't know. If we had known, we would have—" I cut him off with a raised hand. Don't rewrite the past. You knew enough. You knew how to call me an embarrassment. You knew how to push me aside at school events, at birthdays, at graduations, at weddings. You knew how to laugh at me when you thought I couldn't hear. Don't tell me you didn't know." My daughter's eyes filled with tears. "We were young, Dad. We didn't mean it. But please, we need your help now. You can't just let us struggle." I looked at her, and for a moment, I saw the little girl who once clung to my hand. My heart wanted to give in, to wrap her in my arms and tell her everything would be all right. But then I remembered her words. "Don't come, Dad. You'll embarrass me." And the image shattered. "I will not give you anything," I said firmly, "until you learn respect. Money without respect is poison. Love without respect is empty. I gave you both my love freely, and you threw it away. Now, if you want anything from me, you will earn it, not with apologies spoken through clenched teeth, but with actions that prove you see me as your father, not as a burden, not as a shadow, as your father." They sat frozen, unable to respond. My son clenched his fists. My daughter wiped her tears, but neither had an answer. I leaned closer, my voice calm, but sharp as a blade. "Understand this. I owe you nothing. You are not entitled to what I built with my blood and sweat. If you want me in your lives now, it will not be because of what I can give you. It will be because you finally understand who I am." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small in front of them. I didn't feel weak or pitied. I felt strong, standing tall in the truth of my worth. They wanted my wealth, but what they needed was my lesson, and I was going to make sure they learned it. The silence after my words was like a wall closing in on them. For years they had looked at me with eyes full of judgment, but now those same eyes were full of something else, shame. My son tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "Dad, I don't know what to say." He looked down at the table, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time, it wasn't me looking away from them. It was them who couldn't bear to face me. My daughter's tears fell onto the papers spread before her, smudging the ink of the deeds and statements she had once thought impossible for me to own. "We were wrong," she whispered, almost too quietly to hear. "We were so wrong about you." I wanted to tell her that I had known this all along, that their blindness didn't erase my worth. But I stayed silent, letting the weight of their regret sink deeper. This was not about revenge through anger. It was about teaching them the pain of seeing what they had lost. As the days went by, I noticed their pride unraveling bit by bit. My son, who once rolled his eyes at me, now spoke with a softer tone. My daughter, who once avoided me in public, now lingered in my presence as if searching for words she couldn't find. Neighbors who had always respected me greeted me warmly in front of them, and I saw the sting in their faces when they realized how others saw me compared to how they had treated me. One evening, as we sat quietly in the living room, my son finally broke down. His voice trembled, his eyes glistening. "We didn't deserve you, Dad. We never did. We cared more about what people thought than about who you were. And now, I can't stop thinking about all the years we wasted. His words pierced me, but not in the way they once did. This time, they carried not cruelty, but truth. I saw in his face the boy I once held in my arms, the boy who had once clung to me without shame. My daughter joined him, her hands covering her face, whispering through sobs, "We don't deserve forgiveness." For a long time I said nothing. I wanted their regret to grow roots, to be something they could never shake off. They had spent years making me feel invisible, but now it was they who felt small. And as I looked at them, broken by their own choices, I knew the lesson had only just begun. Not long after, the community held a small event at the town hall. They wanted to recognize people who had given back, who had made a difference. To my surprise, they invited me to attend, not as a guest in the corner, but as someone to be honored. I hesitated at first. All my life, I had been told I wasn't good enough, and even though I knew better now, a small part of me still wondered if I belonged up on a stage. But when the day came, I went. I walked into the hall, and to my shock, my children were already there. A neighbor must have told them. They looked uncomfortable, sitting stiff in their seats, not sure what to expect. When my name was called, I stepped onto the stage. The applause that followed shook me to my core. Dozens of people clapped, some even stood. These were not pity claps. These were hands honoring a man who had worked in silence, who had given his heart to help others. One by one, people stood up to speak about me. A mother talked about how my donations to the local foundation helped her child with Down syndrome receive therapy. A shop owner spoke about how I had helped him save his failing business with advice and encouragement. A young man said I was the reason he never gave up on school because he had watched me work harder than anyone he knew. I looked out into the crowd and saw my children's faces. My son's mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide in disbelief. My daughter's tears streamed freely now, her hands clasped together as if she didn't know where else to put them. For the first time, they weren't seeing me through the lens of shame. They were seeing me through the eyes of everyone else. They were seeing me for who I truly was. When the ceremony ended, people surrounded me, shaking my hand, thanking me. My children stood off to the side, watching as neighbors and strangers treated me with the kind of respect they had never given me, and I let them watch. I wanted every handshake, every word of praise, every tear of gratitude from others to burn into their memory, because now the truth was undeniable. The man they had been ashamed of was admired by the world, and the shame they once put on me now belonged to them. That night, when I returned home after the ceremony, my children followed me silently. They didn't know what to say. For years they had seen me as less, as someone to hide, someone to be ashamed of. But tonight, they had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had seen a father who was not weak, but strong. Not invisible, but respected. Not a burden, but a man whose story had inspired others. We sat together in the living room, the same room where so many of our arguments had taken place. My son finally broke the silence. "Dad, we were wrong. We should have been proud of you. We should have stood by you." His voice trembled as he spoke. My daughter added, her face still wet with tears, "We don't deserve your forgiveness, but please don't give up on us." I looked at them for a long moment, my heart heavy. Part of me wanted to let their words wash away all the years of pain, but I couldn't forget. Forgiveness doesn't erase scars. It just teaches you to live with them. I leaned forward and spoke softly but firmly. I may have been born different, but I worked harder than anyone ever gave me credit for. I loved you more than you ever realized. And still, you were ashamed of me. That shame was never mine. It was yours. And you will carry it, just as I carried your rejection. Their eyes dropped to the floor, heavy with regret. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse them. I just told them the truth. If you want to rebuild with me, then show me. Not with words, but with respect. Love without respect is nothing. You must prove that you see me for who I am, your father. The room fell into silence, but it was different now. It wasn't the silence of rejection. It was the silence of realization. They finally understood. And as I looked at them, broken by the weight of their choices, I felt no hate in my heart, only a lesson that needed to be shared. Because in the end, this story isn't just about me. It's about every parent who gives everything and asks for nothing but love in return. To all who are listening, never be ashamed of the ones who raised you, because one day you might discover that the very person you hid from the world was the strongest soul you ever knew. Tell me, if you were in my place, would you forgive them or would you let them live with the regret they created? And before you go, Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine, and comment below where in the world you are listening from. I'll be waiting to hear your voices.